Hi guys, this is the Automatinator and welcome to my first video in my UiPath tips series where I'll be discussing some quick and simple UiPath tips, tricks, and how-tos for UiPath developers. So for this first video, I'd like to just quickly show how to use and create UiPath custom exceptions. So what is a custom exception? Well, a custom exception is going to be an exception that you as the developer can determine what exactly that exception message is going to be. And what this is going to give you is the ability to put in your code exception messages that will tell whoever it is who might be coming along to troubleshoot your code later on, whether that's yourself or someone else. It'll tell them exactly what the situation was that caused the error you ran into, because sometimes UiPath's default exception messages can be a little bit generic or difficult to interpret. And with a custom exception message, you can determine exactly what that message is. So how you create these, it's actually quite simple. What you're going to need is a throw activity. So we're throwing an exception, should make sense. If I pull in the throw activity from my activities list over here on the left, and then open up the exception property of that throw activity, what I'm going to type in here is the word new, followed by the word system exception, followed by an open parentheses, followed by an open quotation mark, and followed by end quotation mark and parentheses. And then the message that I want to put is going to be here within the quotation mark. So I will just create a custom exception message. I will say, this is a really bad error, exclamation mark. That will be my exception message. Now, one thing I will note about this is that this word system exception right here is just telling UiPath what type of exception it is that you're wanting to throw here. So if you've taken the UiPath Academy trainings, you'll know that there's two types of exception that you can throw with UiPath. One's going to be a system or application type exception, and the second is going to be a business rule exception. Now this right here will obviously be throwing a system exception, an application exception. If I wanted to throw a business rule exception instead, I could simply replace the word system rule exception here with the phrase business rule exception. You'll notice no spaces. But if I type new business rule exception, same syntax here, this will simply throw a business rule exception rather than a system exception, still with my custom exception message right here. For this demo, I will go ahead and simply throw a system exception. I'll click OK on that. And let's go ahead and run this just to demonstrate that it does work. We can see my runtime execution error is the source is throw because I threw this from my custom activity. The message is this is a really bad error, exactly what I requested it to be. And the exception type is the system or application exception. So that right there in a nutshell is how you create a custom exception in UiPath. Now that's how you create it. How might you use this in a practical situation? Let me go ahead and do a demonstration. So let's say I have a very simple type into activity. Perhaps I'm typing into Notepad. I will open up Notepad. I will indicate that on screen. And let's make sure that my selector, so it's looking to type into Notepad with the title Untitled. I'll leave it like that, I guess. And let's just put in some custom text here. So it's looking to type into a Notepad entitled Untitled with I love robots being the text it's going to type into there. I'll quickly turn the timeout on this down just for demonstration purposes so none of this takes too long. I will comment out this throw activity. Let's make sure this works first of all. So if I run this file, we should see that it types I love robots into Notepad. Everything worked fine. But an obvious weakness of this automation would be if Notepad's closed, we are going to get an exception. So if I run this file now that Notepad's closed, since I turn that timeout down, it happens almost immediately, but we get the type into Notepad has failed due to cannot find the UI element corresponding to the selector, blah, 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 blah. Now, because I named this activity intelligently, type into Notepad, this would honestly probably give a troubleshooter a good idea of what happened here. But this message itself isn't super transparent about what happened. Unless you have been working with UiPath and selectors for a while, you might not be able to understand this cannot find the UI element corresponding to the selector gibberish. What if instead of this, I wanted whoever's troubleshooting this to know immediately if this step in my process fails, the only reason that could cause this is Notepad not being open. Well, if that was the situation, what I might do is I might pull out a try-catch activity. What a try-catch activity is going to do is it's going to take whichever exception I run into in here. I will have it catch that system exception. So my exception type is system exception. And then this throw activity I had earlier, I will drop that in there. And let's go ahead and update my text as well to say Notepad is not open to type into. So let's just go ahead and run this now. Oh, accidentally clicked the wrong button there. If I go ahead and run this file, I'll go ahead and run it in debug mode so we can kind of see it stepping through. You can see it fails on that type into activity. It gets caught by the try-catch. It actually kind of skipped over my throw there, but if I step out to the end, we will see that it does have my custom error. So it does say Notepad is not open to type into, rather than that could not find the UI element, blah, blah, blah thing that it said earlier. So that gives us a much more custom and understandable exception message, and that is one of the primary ways that you might use custom exceptions in your real-life workflows. So that's one way you could use it. A very similar thing that you could do would be to use an element exists activity. Go ahead and demonstrate this as well. If I pull an element exists in here, and let's just say that I look for Notepad. So I'll indicate Notepad on screen. For the element exists activity, you have one output. I will create a variable, also called Notepad exists. Here in my variable panel, you can see that's a Boolean type variable. And I will then create an if statement. That if statement, my expression is going to be Notepad exists, so my variable I created just a second ago equals true. And if that is true, then we should be able to type into Notepad because Notepad is open. If that's not true, we want to throw the custom error I created earlier. So I will just quickly go ahead and run this. One thing I'm going to quickly do as well, let me adjust this element exists activity a little bit. I'm going to just have it look for any Notepad that's open, and I will set the timeout to be something shorter so that this doesn't take very long in this demo. So if I go ahead and run this now, Notepad is open. We should see it succeed. I'll run it in debug mode so we can see which direction it goes. You can see it went down the successful, the true side of my if statement. Now if I close Notepad, run this again, notice it waits a second, checks for that element. The element does not exist, Notepad is not open, and we are going to once again throw my custom error, Notepad is not open to type into. So this is all well and good, and this is another way that you can use those custom exception messages. But let's think one step deeper, and maybe in a real life situation, if you want to go the extra mile, here's something that you could do in one of your automations. You might kind of combine the two things that we just discussed. So I'm going to bring back out my try catch. I will put my type into Notepad in the body of my try catch. I will have it catch system exceptions. And then within the catch portion for the system exception, first of all, I'll put a sequence followed by my element exists activity I had up here. And I'll first set this up and then I'll explain what I'm doing. We'll then have the if statement right here and a rethrow error. So what am I doing right here? Well, what I'm doing is essentially I'm recognizing that there may be more than one reason why UiPath is unable to type into Notepad. For instance, in this particular situation, you'll remember that when I selected type into Notepad, I simply selected the window as it was. And one thing this does was it's requiring that the notepad that I type into have the title of Untitled Notepad. So let's say that at some point I'm attempting to type into Notepad, but I'm going to go ahead and save this notepad to my desktop with the name different notepad. Okay, so now that has a different name. And if I attempt to run this activity, I'll just pull it out of my try-catch for demonstration purposes. So if I attempt to run this right now, even though Notepad is open, we can see there's a different reason why we could potentially fail right there. So what I'm doing by creating this combined try catch and element exists activity is I'm recognizing that there could be reasons I'm not thinking of why this type into notepad activity might fail. The one I could think of was that notepad is not open, but there could be others as well. So I put type into notepad in the try catch, and then within this exceptions area, I'm going to check to see if element exists notepad, and I'll actually say untitled notepad here because that is, oh, I'm sorry, not untitled notepad. This is just checking. If you remember my selector from earlier, this is just checking for the body of notepad in general, regardless of what the specific name of notepad is there. So not untitled notepad. It's just looking to see if notepad is open at all. If it does exist, so if notepad is open, then we know that the reason that we weren't able to type into notepad is not that notepad was not open. Obviously, if notepad is open, then it's not open. So in that situation, we'd simply rethrow the exception that we'd caught earlier. We don't know what that exception might be. We can't throw a more intelligent exception message for it. So we just rethrow the current error. And in the other situation, we throw our custom error, which is still going to be notepad is not open to type into. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this in both scenarios. If I run the file right now, we'll notice we get a generic error. This is because it's rethrowing the error that occurred when this type into notepad activity failed, because it did check and it did say that notepad was open. It just has a different title. Whereas if I actually don't have notepad open at all and run this activity, we will get the second of those two options, which is notepad is not open to type into. So in situations where we do know what caused the process to error out, we can put a more intelligent error in there, a custom exception message. When we don't know, we simply let the default exception message go through. So there you have it. Those are the two ways that you might use custom exception messages in your UiPath workflows, or two of the most common, I will say, not the only two by any means. And that is, once again, the syntax for that is going to be, if you're creating a custom exception message, it's going to be new system exception, notepad is not open to type into, or whatever your exception message is, or you can replace that system exception with business rule exception if you'd rather throw a business exception. That's all today. Thank you very much. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you liked what you saw here today.